I'd love to start just getting to know each of you a little bit and your backgrounds, how you came to us, and to the big brands that each one of you has created. And well, I need to, Esther, there's so many ways to describe you that I'm going to pull your own words, if I can find them. Investor, journalist, author, commenter, and philanthropist. All of those things. So you've built this multifaceted brand of things that you're passionate about. I know you're working on a book right now that I think is bringing a lot of that together. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that, what's brought you here and what you're working on right now?
Sure. I really don't think of all those words as a brand, but anyway, the book, but I love playing with words. The way I like to describe myself as a court jester, J-E-S-T-H-E-R. The court jester tells the truth to power, but also is very discreet. So they know a lot of secrets and they keep them. But every once in a while they tell the truth at an awkward moment where it really matters. My book is called Term Limits, and I hope that one gets a brand. The idea of term limits is not political. It's really the term limits of human life in a world where out in Silicon Valley, everybody wants to live forever. They want more of, actually, who here remembers the Lone Star Cafe on 13th of, yeah, great. Anyone have a photograph of it? Because I'm using one, but I don't know who has the rights, and I figure it's worth the risk. But if somebody has it.
We appreciate you just like going on the record that your infringement is willful and intentional. So maybe rethink that. Keep going.
Whatever, this is all off the record. Anyway, on top it had an iguana. It was the Lone Star Cafe, sort of Texas. Yeah. And on the side it said, "Too much ain't enough." And that's sort of the vibe of, I want to live forever, I need everything, I need more money, I need more power. And the fact that you don't live forever is actually really good for your soul. And in a sense, it's good for your happiness. If you lived forever, like, you'd have to learn every language in the world, you'd have to do everything, you'd be, I cracked my wrist a few years ago falling on a sidewalk. It only needs to last as long as I do. It doesn't need to last forever. And that's kind of comforting. And I can't do everything, so I can do the stuff I think is most important first and forget about the rest.
When you talk about the things that are most important, there's a family health crisis that you've spoken publicly about years ago regarding your sister that led you to train to be a cosmonaut. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
I mean, calling it a family, how shall I say, it was a crisis, but it wasn't. My sister discovered that she had the right genes for breast cancer and decided to have a double mastectomy. Or maybe she found some cancer. How shall I say, it was real. We cried, but in the end it ended up being, they got rid of it, and otherwise I would never ever tell this story. So, but a month or two after that, I was an investor in this company called Space Adventures, which is basically the travel agency for the space tourists. And they kept saying to me, we know you can't afford the $20 million to go into space, but if you'd like to train as a cosmonaut for 6 months, we could arrange that. And I kept saying, yeah, sure, I'd love to sometime. And about a month or two after this thing happened with my sister, and she'd had the operation and so forth, I was on the phone with somebody trying to arrange a meeting, and there was a conflict, and there was another and I thought, if I just had breast cancer, I could cancel everything. And I thought, what? This is breast cancer, you shouldn't need breast cancer to say no to a meeting. And I decided, this is crazy. I keep thinking I'm happy, but... So I called them up and said, when's the next time? And they said it starts September 2008. I I was working hard, but I didn't really have a day job. And I said, sure, 6 months, I'll go. And my father, who was sort of a space guy, an astrophysicist, everything I ever did, I lived in England for a year when I was 13. I went to Morocco with my boyfriend when I was 17. Every time it was, well, that's really nice. I hope it goes well, and just, be careful. We won't come fix it, but we love you. This time he jumped out of his chair and hugged me, and I realized, oh, this is what he's wanted to do since he was 6 years old. And so I was a backup to Charles Simoni, who wrote Microsoft Word for Microsoft. And when he finally went up in March, I was the backup. I didn't go, but of course I was there at the launch. And my brother and my father and my stepmother all came out to Baikonur in Kazakhstan to watch that. And it was amazing. And so I didn't get to go into space, but I can talk about the lottery ticket now or later.
You should talk about it now.
Okay. And then it's Ryan's turn.
No, I'm listening. I'm good. Yeah, I'm enjoying this.
Ryan's going to borrow Salisa's guitar.
Yes,
No.
that's right.
So when you go into space, it's really bad PR if you die. So they do a lot of kind of inspection in advance, and they do X-rays, and the Russian X-rays are really bad. The dentists are painful, and they gave me an endoscopy with Valium, not with anesthesia, and discovered I had Barrett's esophagus, which is not a short-term thing, but it's a precursor to cancer of the esophagus. So every year after that, I was scoped, and in 2016, it turned out I had stage 0 cancer of the esophagus, which you never, ever, people usually discover it when it's too late. So my lottery ticket was not a trip to space, but it was that I'm alive now. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a hard one to pivot from, as amazing as your story is, Ryan. I don't know if you've lottery tickets, but maybe you could tell us a little bit about, I know you've seen some hard stuff and found opportunity there, maybe in like Alabama during the mortgage crisis or something like that.
Well, first, good evening, everybody. I'm Ryan Williams. I didn't really hear a round of applause for Esther's story and for the music. Yeah, Ed did not warn me how intimidating and how high the bar was going to be before I came up here. So thank you for throwing me into the deep end. I will learn how to swim. But part of my life story. So I'm actually from Louisiana. Alabama's a big rival of.
I know you're from Louisiana, but I thought your friends from Harvard took you to Alabama to look at some real estate.
Atlanta. A similarities.
I think there may be some wrong information on the internet.
Oh, you know what? That would not be the first time. So, you know what? I completely believe it. But I have a life mission, and I've done a lot of work to try to crystallize this of promoting self-determination amongst the underserved. And that comes in all walks and facets of life, and it sounds a little fluffy, but it's real. And it's one of the connective tissues throughout my journey. So I was born in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. First one of my family to go to, God bless you, a 4-year school. First one of my family to go to school outside the state of Louisiana, outside the city of Baton Rouge. And for me and for my family, what was echoed was that education was really the way out. It wasn't that many generations where my ancestors were enslaved. And I always use that as a reminder of no matter what I was facing, the things aren't that bad. And I think that is universal. And it doesn't matter, if your ancestors were coming across the Atlantic or, born into tough circumstances. There's struggle, and I always felt like if I were able to put things in the right perspective, then I'd be able to prosper in the face of any adversity that I encountered. And I don't know if that's intrinsic or extrinsic or a combination of both, but looking back in life, that is something that really resonated with me. And so I use the education point because my granddad was pastor of the biggest church in the city of New Orleans. New Orleans is like hour-ish outside of Baton Rouge, and if you drive it really quickly, you can get there faster. And I've tried. He didn't graduate from college. He was the first black principal of a school in the city of Baton Rouge. It just shows you kind of Jim Crow, an integrated school, I should say. He was also the first one to help integrate the schools across the state as well, and so he was a pioneer, and he in his own ways really reset standards in the bar for me and for my family, because he was like my dad figure growing up as well. And so throughout my experience, I always, prioritized education, and I always had this curiosity, this question of why not, or what can be. And when people ask me what is entrepreneurship, at its essence, at its core, it's a perspective. It's looking at the world and seeing what others see as challenges, as opportunities, asking, why can't something be solved? And you hear about first principles thinking a lot, and again, to me, that's what it was about. So I ended up starting my first business asking that same question, what if, when I was 13 in Louisiana. And I asked what if it was possible to look cool and wear sports apparel the same way I saw these athletes that I looked at TV wearing sports apparel, and I couldn't afford a Nike or an Adidas or a Jordan headband or wristband. So long story short, I ended up building a customized headband and wristband business back when those things were still cool. I ended up selling a number of the wristbands to LSU, Louisiana State University, our flagship school, and I ended up selling to JP Morgan for their Take Your Sons and Daughters to Work Day. And it became, an incredible endeavor for me. I don't mention a bunch of different things that I started that did not work out, but that was, the first venture in Louisiana that I built that also helped make a little bit of side cash for me. And through that endeavor, I was fortunate to enter into the National Foundation for Teaching Entrepreneurship, or NFTE's entrepreneurship program. And I ended up winning the national prize a few years in a row. Got mentors from places like Goldman Sachs, which sounded like a kind of cartoonish name, but it sounded very wealthy. And so through Goldman, I was able to come to New York, get mentors, and then get encouraged, most importantly, to think more broadly. To ask why not, me going to school outside of the state of Louisiana. And so I was fortunate that one of my mentors paid for the tuition, or not the tuition, but the application bill. I applied to Harvard, and I was accepted to Harvard College, and that changed the trajectory of my life in so many different ways. I saw Harvard as a playground of resources. A lot of people see it as a bastion of excellence and of academic rigor and the like. But for me, it was an opportunity to really build that entrepreneurial muscle, and that's exactly what I did. And I won't go through all the different ventures and businesses, but I will go back to the Alabama point.
Atlanta.
Yes. But if there is that online, then we're going to try to correct it. Although we're not that successful most of the time. Yeah, good luck. That's right. So anyway, I started a business during the subprime credit crisis, buying foreclosed single-family homes. Right place, right time. My roommate from college is from Atlanta, Georgia. Actually, very similar story to me. He played football at Harvard, and I visited him because, if you know about the airplane situation in Louisiana, from New York or Boston, you can't take direct flights to Baton Rouge. So we had a layover in Atlanta, and my flight was delayed, surprise. And I called my roommate and I said, hey man, can I come by your place and let's catch up? I got like a 4-hour layover. He lived about 15 minutes down south of the airport, and he said, of course, come by. And as I was driving around the cul-de-sac, what I noticed up and down his street was there were foreclosures left and right. And it looked like a graveyard, to be honest, of homes. And I'd been there a year before, and the street was immaculate. So again, the question went back to, or the perspective went back to, what if, I was able to reset, the environment and make it feel like a vibrant, a neighborhood and society again. And so the first step was asking my roommate that question. He's like, you're crazy, man. But, my dad's house is being foreclosed on. And, maybe there is a path. And so I did a little bit of thinking, and I came up with a perspective and a conclusion that we went to school with a lot of kids with a lot more liquidity and wealth than us. And if we could raise money from those students to buy back these homes that were going into foreclosure, rent them back out to members of the community, in this case, my roommate's dad, then we could do well and do good. And so, again, long story short, I ended up negotiating with the bank, buying the home back. We ended up buying it for pennies on the dollar, about $65,000. We raised that money from classmates, and we ended up renting it back out to his dad. He paid back everything on time, sold the home back for $185K about a year and a half later, 3 times our money, ballpark, unlevered, and then took that model and applied it to dozens of homes and units. 3 years later, we had a portfolio of 1,000 homes that we owned throughout the city and the metro area of Atlanta. So we were one of the top 15 largest owner of residential homes in Atlanta. And that business built more onto that entrepreneurial muscle. And so the last point I'll say, and then I'll stop talking, is I graduated from college. I had to pay off my student loans. I didn't structure my deal as well as I should have. Lesson learned. So I wasn't making that much cash, even though we were, generating a lot of cash. So I worked at Goldman Sachs doing tech banking by day, by night. I was running this business. And eventually I made the decision I was going to leave Goldman, focus on moving to Atlanta and building out the business full time. Because at that point we were making enough cash where, I could actually see a path forward for me and for my family. 2 weeks before I was going to resign, and I had written up my script. This was pre-AI, so I actually had to write it. I put all the pages together. I had everything in a manila folder on my desk, and I got a call at my office, and it was from a strange number, and it ended up being from a firm called Blackstone, and it ended up being from an individual named Jonathan Gray, who's now the president at Blackstone, was the head of real estate at the time. And he has Steve Schwarzman on the line. Steve's the CEO and co-founder of Blackstone as well. And they asked if I could meet, and I said, yes. You tell me the place, the time, what I need to bring for you all, if you're hungry. No, I didn't say all that. But I ended up going to a coffee shop nearby. And similar to what I just walked you all through, I explained what I was creating and I was building. And after doing a bunch of diligence, they made an offer to buy about half of the portfolio that we owned. They asked to acquire the rights to the IP and the tech, because we had built a data warehouse, aggregating information. This is pre-Zillow, pre-Trulia, pre-Redfin. So we were able to scrape all the bank websites. And they acquired that, and I was the second team member of a business that we'd later take public, that now is around $15 billion market cap, called Invitation Homes. And at one point it was the largest landlord of homes in the country, owned south of 100,000 homes. There's been a lot of talk now about institutions owning homes. So happy I got out that business. But it was an incredible experience. Took the lessons that I learned there, and I asked another question. I said, what if instead of all this wealth accruing to the benefit of endowments and sovereign wealth funds and public pensions and foundations. What if I could build a Blackstone for the masses? And that question ultimately led me to found a business called Cadre. A decade plus later, we had acquired more than $6.5 billion of assets. We allowed more than 100,000 individual retail investors to access fractional stakes in those homes. We created the industry's first secondary market so people could trade those fractional stakes. And throughout that entire journey, I focused a lot on, to the brand question, the people around me, the social proof, the validation of what we had done. So people knew this was an adverse selection. And I focused on the mission, and that never changed, despite all the other things that did change. People that were behind the business, the geopolitical situation and economy. Through that experience, I ultimately was fortunate to have one of the largest fintech sales of 2024, sold the business to another fintech company, and learned a lot, about building businesses in highly regulated spaces. Shout out to my GC, who's sitting right over there, Alyssa Port, who has helped, ensure we have the right guardrails, especially in this age of AI. And I'm now working on a new stealth business. Proud to call Ed a partner, an investor, the Lowenstein team partners, and the future's bright.
What does that business do?
Oh, that's the question. Ed, I thought we weren't talking about that. No, I'm joking. The company that I'm building is a company called Ellis, as in Ellis Island. And there's a whole backstory that I won't bore you all with on how I came to that name. But we're solving, I would state unequivocally our biggest problem at Cadre, which was it was incredibly costly, time-consuming, and frustrating to be able to report and offer insights and information on the investments that we acquired. We had to go through all these vendors who could do the accounting, some could do the accounting, some could do the reporting, some could do the compliance. We're basically solving that problem using AI. And so what we're working on now is building an AI native first business to address that problem amongst many others as well.
For properties.
Across alternatives, across the alternative asset class space. So real estate credit is one of the spaces that we could be solving for.
By the way, you don't have to answer her question.
Well, I'm sitting right next to her, so.
But it is our favorite when you two interview each other and we get to listen.
No, it's great.
That's our favorite.
It's great. I
Putting
just
the
felt
pressure
like
on me, so.
later in my defense, I would probably want to have said that. I said it at the wrong time, but I think that was great.
Thank you.
That was
I'll
great.
stop talking now.
No, this is awesome, and I also love the having all of my forebears went through Ellis Island, and we certainly are in an immigration crisis and a xenophobia crisis right now, and so I think it's also amazing to take that name and do something like what you're doing with it, and you have a history of democratizing things, and we need a lot more democratization right now. So,
Right. And it all goes back to, economic self-determination in this case. Making sure we level the playing field, making sure everybody's got an opportunity to be the best versions of themselves, because I do believe the economic challenges that so many people face hold them back from being the best versions of themselves. Pursuing the things that, give them purpose and excitement, and hopefully, we can change that dynamic.
So Ryan is someone who so clearly has a thesis and so brilliantly articulates that thesis. And Esther, you have talked about the fact that as an angel investor, which you are a prolific angel and have been for many years, you have no thesis as an investor. Is that still accurate, or has that changed?
My thesis is invest in things I believe in, people I believe in, but it's not like do these 3 calculations and here are the pros and cons. It's more, is it something so the first part of the thesis is there's way more opportunities out there than I can afford to invest in. So just relax. You're going to miss stuff all the time. That's not the problem. And the second is, it's a quadrant chart, learning versus earning. The more you learn, most likely the less you will earn. I did this 10-year nonprofit project and paid for it with stock in Square and Meta, Facebook. I learned nothing from either of them because they were, just checks. And the guys didn't really need much of my help. The things I learned from were the ones that had problems, put it that way. And I mean, the best example you were asking me about is 23andMe. It was great. I learned all about genetics. I got to go eat lunch at Google when I was visiting 23andMe because the founder was married to Sergey Brin, one of the co-founders of Google. I got my genome sequenced. We did stuff at Davos. It was amazing. Unfortunately, the company didn't work out quite that well, and I didn't make money, but yeah, and to your point, you have to be lucky enough to have enough money that you can spread it thin and get lucky. If you don't have enough money, you can't make even good bets, because if that 10% chance of it going wrong doesn't work out, you're toast. So just one has to be lucky to start, and then one also has to understand how lucky one is. But then, so in this book, I'm talking a little bit about the issues of everything's trying to get too efficient. Let's be more efficient with our advertising. Let's be more efficient with our philanthropy. Let's just have some AI figure out what's the best use of the funds. But in so many parts of life, the friction is the value, or the other thing, the journey. It's not the destination, it's the journey you take getting there. So I invest for journeys. And yeah, I invested in this company that makes underwear in Sri Lanka. And the real reason I invested in it was so that I could get a round trip business class fare to Sri Lanka and look at a factory where they're making underwear. And then I sort of spent a day talking to dissidents and other things in Sri Lanka, and it was amazing. That's an example of being present without leave.
And did any of the people who were modeling that underwear in Sri Lanka come into America on Einstein visas, or that's not?
They weren't modeling it, they were just making it.
I understand. But you did actually, and I know you were young at the time, but
Yeah.
because your father worked with Einstein, you did spend a little bit of time with Einstein when you were very young.
Yes, but again, Mrs. Pennypacker was much more important. She was my first grade teacher. Einstein was just this guy my dad knew.
And can we talk about ICANN, which I think you also
Sure.
maybe learned but didn't earn from, or at least your earnings were indirect?
No, I mean, financially, totally, it was a not-for-profit.
Yeah.
So ICANN is the outfit that regulates the domain name system. All the top-level domains like .org and .net, and now there's way too many of them. So I'll be brief on this. I was chair the first 2 years, mostly because nobody else would.
I just want to interrupt for 1 second before you do the mostly because nobody else would do it thing. But just so that we're clear, at the beginning of the internet from 98 to 2000, Esther chaired ICANN, Esther chaired the internet. I'm just saying, there's no but or
Okay.
because no one else wanted to do it, just you chaired the internet.
Yeah, I'll tell you, since you prompted, so I was at Davos one of those years, and on the street somewhere, ran into some guy. He says, "Oh, hello, good, who are you? Who's your husband?" And I said, "I don't have a husband." And then he said, "Well, do you represent a country?" And it took a few more questions, and then finally I just got sort of annoyed, and I said, "Well, actually, I run the internet." And
Mic drop. Mic drop. There we go.
You have to wait for the punchline. So then he says, "Oh, the Wi-Fi here is so good."
Are you going to tell us who that was?
No. Honestly, I don't know who he was. He probably represented some country. But
I'm sorry, are you going to tell us who his wife was?
lots of good stories. Sometime you can ask me about the dinner with Mick Jagger, but
You can't just leave us
can't
hanging
leave
like that.
things
You
like
know,
that.
it's
Tell
like,
us about
you
the
know,
dinner with Mick Jagger and about the photo you posted of yourself with Epstein.
okay.
We'll do a +1, -1.
Ooh, right. That's yeah.
I'll start with Mick Jagger, but I will do the Epstein one too. And then finally I'll talk about ICANN and AI. But so dinner sponsored by Bain. Arthur Sulzberger Jr. was moderating, 10 or 12 people about important events. And the guy from Bain is talking and says, blah, blah, blah. So when David Cameron became head of state, blah, blah, blah. And Mick Jagger. So I forgot. I was sitting next to Mick Jagger. And afterwards, he left right away. I didn't get really to talk to him other than this bit. But I stole his little place card that I still treasure. Anyway, David Cameron says, the Bain guy says, Cameron became head of state. And Mick Jagger leans over and says, actually, the Queen is head of state. And that was my dinner with Mick Jagger.
I love it. I love it.
Okay, Jeffrey Epstein. There is a picture of me on Flickr. This was, I think, 1996 or 1998, when things were quite bad in Russia. I was flying around Russia with Nathan Myhrvold, the CTO of Microsoft, in his Gulfstream, because he wanted to learn more about Soviet science. And backstory, I'd been going to Russia regularly since 1989, ended in February of 2022. And he told me we're spending, said the deal was he would pay for my hotel and I could fly with him in his Gulfstream, and I spoke
Nathan
Russian.
would pay for your hotel.
Nathan, yeah,
Myhrvold.
sorry, not Epstein. See,
I'm
this
just
is
clarifying.
how,
See how I'm helping?
yeah, no, this is great. This is how LLMs get things wrong.
Hallucinations. That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
But just, they sort of mix up these little details.
Yeah.
So he had this finance friend called Jeffrey who was going to come in his own Gulfstream while we were in Sarov, which is the nuclear city where the famous physicist Sakharov lived, and so forth and so on. And this guy Epstein showed up. He was actually, for a finance guy, pretty with it. It was tough times, and in this closed city, you had to have a pass to get in and so forth. Basically, the women were at home, the workmen were wearing overalls, and the scientists were wearing bad suits. And this guy in a bad suit comes along, and Jeffrey Epstein asks him, "So when were you last paid?" And the scientist looks at his feet, sees a hole in his sneakers, and says, "Well, it was January, but we get lunch every day." And I just thought, this finance guy, he gets what's going on here. And somebody offered, it might have been Nathan, I'm not sure, but somebody took my camera and I stood in front of Sakharov's house with Jeffrey Epstein and got the photo and posted it on Flickr. And to my credit, I spelled Jeffrey's name wrong. But it's up there, and I didn't take it down because that would be even worse than having it up there. And yeah, that's the other story. Rich and the famous.
Meredith?
You're giving me nothing to pivot on here. We did have an amazing session with our pod with a couple dozen amazing founders before this, and they had some questions they were hoping the two of you could answer. So, you've made a lot of decisions about in which businesses to invest, and Ryan, you're building, I don't know how many you've built at this point, many, right?
Yes.
And so one of the questions was, how do you think about a founder's personal brand versus the company's brand. And the notes we were talking about were, it's very obvious when they're one and the same, and that happens a lot. But can they diverge? Is there room for that? Is there room for an introverted founder, for example? So when you're building your company, when you're assessing companies, how do you think about that?
I think she was looking at you.
Whoever wants it.
I'll cut you off if you're going too long, but you should start.
Yeah, I don't think about it that much in that way, but I do look for companies that are mission driven in general. And so you can't really be mission driven if your founder is not. So I would say, but I'm less focused on brands and consumer things anyway than, I really like useful stuff. The first company I ever worked with was FedEx when I was on Wall Street, Federal Express. And yeah, logistics is really boring, but I love it.
Great. It's a great question. It's one that I've definitely struggled with in certain cases, because as entrepreneurs, your personal brand and the brand of the business you're building can become so inextricably linked that it's not healthy, frankly, at times. And so, to answer your question, yes, I do think it's possible to build a business where your personal brand of the business, the mission of the business diverge and are not one and the same. And I think that's perfectly fine as well, especially if it's an opportunity and an idea that has resulted out of building a previous venture in business. I like to, when I'm building businesses or starting companies, and again, I don't want to make this sound all glorious, because 95% plus of businesses do not make it, do not survive. And so you go in knowing that that's the case, and so you got to give yourself every opportunity to ensure that your business achieves its goal and fulfills the promise of what you're starting. But I like to think of the businesses that are most interesting from a brand perspective as those where you've got some unique insight. You have an unfair advantage, so to speak. You've started a company where you've seen through that business certain inefficiencies, friction points that are definitely not necessary, and you're able to execute and bring people together, in a unified way to solve and ask that question and answer that question. What if? What if I could, build a business and a company that solves some of the things that have become the bane of my prior existence or my current existence, and that's perfectly fine. And in many cases, a lot of those businesses will have brands and will have missions that don't directly tie to your personal mission. Like I said, many great companies have been built that way. There are a lot of people who have started doing B2B, have gone to B2C and vice versa, or B2B2C. And again, I think it's perfectly fine, as long as you're going in with a thesis and a well-defined problem and a well-defined approach and solution, and success metrics as well. So I think it's completely possible. In my personal case, I love building businesses and companies that I have very close alignment with from a personal brand and mission perspective. Forgot who it was. I think it was Steve Jobs. But the reality is, like I said, most companies don't make it. And so, and there's so many challenges, seen and unseen, those that you can forecast and project, those that you can't, a lot more that you can't. I think about my last business that I started, Cadre, and in addition to all the challenges that you have with just reaching escape velocity and getting to a point where you have product market fit and where you have people using your business, especially in an industry like real estate, and an industry where people laughed at the time at the concept rather of bringing tech and real estate together, and prop tech was like I was told a gimmicky word I should never use again, which I then used again. Despite that dynamic and the challenges that I faced just creating a new industry in a lot of ways, there were also many unforeseen challenges as well. We had a pandemic. We had geopolitical challenges. A lot of that's been reported on, so I won't beat a dead horse, or dead horses, as the media like to do. I've learned, and I learned so much from that experience, and had I not had alignment, from a personal brand perspective, in that case, it was about democratizing access to an asset class like real estate that had historically been challenging for the vast majority of our global economy to access, leveling the playing field, something I personally deeply cared about because it related to my own upbringing. But if I didn't have that personal affinity and connection, then there are a lot of times where I would have taken a path or I either tried to sell the business early or probably made suboptimal decisions in the long run, in the long term. So you've got to have, for most companies, a deep, deep passion, love, and care. But there's always examples of companies where the opportunity is so great and the friction that you've identified is so clear that irrespective of the brand and irrespective of your personal brand and mission, it's hard not to pursue the opportunity.
I will push back, and just with one other story. There was this woman who had a business that dealt with the microbiome, which is now pretty well known and so forth. And she was a scientist, and I thought it was quite an interesting business, but I figured she really needed a business partner. And I asked her if exactly that, you clearly understand this business, but I think you probably need a co-founder or somebody. And how would you feel about not being CEO? Oh, I've always wanted to be CEO. And I don't think that's a proper mission, honestly. And I did not invest, and 2 years later, the company was, and I don't blame her. I actually blame the board, she got taken away by, in handcuffs for committing insurance.
Were you a member of the board?
No, I didn't invest.
At all? So you're just advising?
No, I wasn't advising. I was turning her
pitched and
down
passed.
as an investor.
Okay. So you're looking at
But you passed
Yeah.
because she wanted to be CEO and she wasn't necessarily suited for the role?
No, because I don't think that's a proper mission.
Her personal mission was to be CEO, and that was,
exactly.
that was the flag.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry if I was unclear. But so anyway, she committed insurance fraud by having people. I discovered this because, I didn't think she would be the right person, but I thought this was an interesting test. So I took it, and then 6 months later, I get this email saying, "We'd like to analyze you again, and insurance will pay for it, blah, blah, blah." And, you get this questionnaire saying, "Have you ever had diarrhea?" Well, yeah, I have, but I'm not suffering from Crohn's disease. And anyway, insurance fraud. The day after that, I mean, because I was watching this, I was interested, and I liked the technology. I just didn't think that it was going to go far. The board had disappeared from the website. And, you just imagine, hey, she's a smart scientist. She doesn't really understand the business. We'll just tell her insurance fraud is okay. And
That's crazy. Wow.
yeah.
Well, we do have a problem with people being unwilling to say no to founders, and people being unwilling to incur the reputational expense of going against a founder, because that is now verboten, and that's actually terrible governance, and it's bad business guidance, and you can't really You can't really help the company by just rubber stamping whatever the founders or founder wants to do.
No, but in this case, I think actually the board probably told her to do it.
I think the board conspired with her to commit fraud.
Yeah, hey, girl, we need more revenues. You just,
Yeah, look, I'll add on too. There was for sure a point in time, zero interest rate environment where, and I'm not saying this happened with us,
Yeah.
but
no, of course not.
of course not.
But you're not saying it didn't either. Sorry.
Thank you, Ed, for
Don't talk-
adding that
there's a
counterpoint.
lawyer in the
That's
room.
right. A lot of lawyers in the room. Trust me, a lot. I can tell. I can feel the legal authority. There was this window where it was growth at all costs, and people threw out the profitability dimension and dynamic. As a founder and a CEO, building a business during that time. And look, I had, from an investor and board observer or board level perspective, folks like Vinod Khosla, Mark Andreessen, Joel Cutler, General Catalyst, Josh Kushner, who's a close friend of Thrive Capital, you name it. At the board level telling me, it was a growth, it was a growth game at the end of the day. And as a founder and a CEO, or either, it can be really challenging to have, the maturity and the conviction to push back, against some of those dynamics that just don't feel right, to you as a steward of your investors' capital. And I think to your point, it can become very dangerous when you don't have that level of conviction. And fortunately, I had advisors, not necessarily board members, but advisors who were willing to take the long view and say, if you look back 20, 30, 40 years ago, right, there were cycles where this exact dynamic was happening. And, the companies that endured were the ones that were responsible, good stewards, and to your point, did not go with the flow, so to speak. Yeah.
All right, that's a great place to end it, being good stewards of capital, being a very core piece of brand for all of us in the venture space. So with that, thank you.
Can I just ask Esther one last question?
I mean, I guess.
You talked about getting pitched and passing. You were the first investor in a company called Ezra that we worked with for years and that we represented in their large exit to Function Health. And Emmy, the CEO, who has spent a lot of time with Meredith, who led his M&A deal, and our partner Eric Weiner, and with me in a couple of different things, asked us to ask you about the experience of being the first investor in that company. And as part of your personal brand as an angel investor, being the first yes is a big deal. If you can talk a little bit about that, and we'll wrap up.
So I was an investor in Emmy's previous company, which was basically video marketing. And I'm not a big fan of video marketing. If you've heard, I'm more focused on things that are fundamentally useful rather than,
Like underwear.
well, trips to Sri Lanka. But I've spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe, as I mentioned, and he was from Romania, so I met him basically through that and really liked him and so forth, and it was great. I was on the board of Meetup for from 20-something to the point at which they basically got bought and eviscerated by WeWork. And my office was at WeWork for 10 years, and when that ended, the investment in Ezra was still pretty recent, and Emmy offered for me to come and work out of his office instead of the Meetup office, which I had loved. As you sort of guessed, I kind of like having a close relationship with the companies and feeling useful. So it was wonderful. I've tried out many of their different scans. I've just watched the company grow. Emmy himself So, as I mentioned, he came out of video advertising. He had cancer in his family, but he was not a radiologist or a medical guy or anything at all. And he was smart enough to surround himself with people who were not smarter, but more schooled in that business, in that technology, and so forth. And he just was a really great manager and built the company. And it was just, to be honest, now that they've been acquired by Function, my term limits there are probably going to end at some point, and I'm hoping to find another company where I can move in with them and spend the next 10 years.
Welcome to hang out here.
Yeah, who knows?
I love that I'm continuing to learn new things about Emmy, who has become a personal friend of mine
Yeah.
since we did that deal together
And his
last year. And I'm going down to Austin to hang with them in a couple weeks, his new home.
Great.
I have also had the scans and met a lot of his amazing team members. And one of my favorite anecdotes from them is he's so passionate and hard charging that when his team needs a break from him, they go and they get a scan because nobody can email you when you are in the MRI machine.
Even that MRI machine is not as annoying, whatever.
All right. Well, with that, Esther, Ryan, thank you so much. And Celeste can't hear me right now, but I'm very grateful that she spoke to us and that we're going to now get to go hear her perform a bit more. To the Lowe and Sandler team who helped put this together, helped us prepare, thank you so much. And now let's go enjoy one another's company and some great music.